Yep, thank you again, Emily. And look, I'd certainly like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country where I'm at. I live up in the Hornsby Shire, so that's the Darug and Ku-ring-gai country. I'd very much hope to be actually giving this presentation from the Dharawal Elders Group up in Walgett, but we weren't. Unfortunately, we had to turn back and head back to Sydney, but not to worry. Certainly, I'd like to acknowledge all the elders up at the Dharawal Elders Group. Clem, Virginia, Wendy as well, who helps run the organisation. I hope you're all doing well if you're watching, and I'm looking forward to getting up to Walgett soon. And certainly I'd like to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening here and watching here today, and acknowledge the elders past and present. So today, look, I'm going to talk about a series of records that I've looked at quite extensively through the work that I've done investigating the history of Aboriginal trackers, but also the work I've done for native title and broader Aboriginal history projects as well, including records relating to trackers and jail photographs. You can see a jail photograph there of an Aboriginal fellow known as William Field or Billy Bogan. And I'll be getting to his story a little bit later on. I mean, just to begin, just as a cultural warning, this presentation does contain photographs and names of Aboriginal people who have passed away, but also language too that from the 1800s that is clearly very derogatory today, but is there in the record. So I just wanted to give that warning. So before we get to the police salary registers, I'll just give you a bit of background information about who were Aboriginal trackers, what were their skills. So from very early on in the colonial period and in New South Wales right through to 1973, police and law enforcement often relied on the traditional bush skills of Aboriginal men and some women as well to do a variety of tasks, to pursue escaped convicts, to pursue bushrangers, to solve various pastoral and agricultural crimes, a whole range of jobs that Aboriginal trackers did using their traditional bush skills, their fantastic powers of observation, to be able to read the landscape and notice changes in the landscape that people make when they walk through it. So they'd drawn that from their traditional life on the land when they were hunting, for example, and then they'd use those skills in the context for the police. It's a very controversial history as well. Today's presentation is very much looking at records from 1863 onwards, when the current New South Wales Police Force was formed. But of course, trackers were also used at times to pursue other Aboriginal people in the native police and after 1863 as well. And look, that's something that I go into in depth in my book Pathfinder. So it's a very controversial history. Nevertheless, there's a lot of information there that I think is of interest, particularly to Aboriginal families who are researching their own family history. And in terms of trackers, there were over 1,000 Aboriginal men and women who were employed from 1863 through to 1973, when Norman Walford, the last tracker up at Walgett, when he retired. So there's a range of records that the families can look into to find out more about their ancestors' work that they did for the police as trackers. So this particular series of records are called the police salary registers. And from 1863 onwards up to about 1916, when this series of records finished, there was actually separate pages for Aboriginal trackers. And so they would list the name of the tracker. To begin with, they just put the district. They didn't put the particular station where they were employed. They listed how much they were paid, and you can also then trace the duration of their employment. So particularly early on, it's very difficult to necessarily find out more about many of these trackers, because the way their names were recorded, they were simply recorded as first names. And you can sort of see here that there was a fellow called Paddy or another fellow called Barney. And it can be difficult then to build up a broader picture about the lives of those trackers. Sometimes you can get a sense of where they were working. Like, for example, there's a fellow here in this 1863 register called Walgett Billy. Now, that could possibly mean that he was the tracker at Walgett, or also it could also mean that he may have come from Walgett and then worked elsewhere. Quite a lot of trackers worked on their traditional country. Others travelled quite extensively to work for the police. So you have to look at other information at times to provide the context. There's another fellow here called George Miranda. Now, there's a lot of written about George Miranda. He probably was a Gundungurra speaker, and he lived in and around the Blue Mountains over towards Bathurst as well. And there are various stories about his tracking career. But down the bottom, I'm not sure if you can see the little, I probably should have highlighted it, but I can see the little pointer there is Will Dargan, or Billy Dargan. I'll be coming back to him later as well. He's quite a very well-known tracker for his role in pursuing Ben Hall. So, and I'm going to look at another record relating to William Dargan a little later on. So moving on, I'm going to show you another police salary register. This time it's from 1894. Now, by this time, they're starting to record a little bit more detail in the salary register. They're actually listing the station where the tracker was employed. So you can see up the top at Blackville. This is all up in the northwestern part of New South Wales. So it's up around the Liverpool Plains, heading up towards Moree, and then up towards the border as well. So you can see at Blackville, which I think is in the southern part of the Liverpool Plains, was a tracker called R. St. John. He was actually Robert St. John. And there's a little bit of other information about him as well. But then you can see trackers who are employed at Boggabilla and Warialda and Moree. I mean, again, sometimes they're just a single name is just recorded, like you can see from Palomaloa, which is a little village about 50 k's east of Moree. To begin the year of 1894, there's a tracker called Alec, and I don't know. I'm not really sure who Alec was. Unfortunately, there's not much information about him. But below that, when Alec left the force, then he was replaced by another tracker called Mungo Park. And I have been able to find out a bit more about Mungo Park. Mungo Park is the name of an old Scottish explorer, I think, who worked in Africa for a while. So, and for some reason we don't know why, this Aboriginal fellow was given this name as well, and he ended up working as a tracker. Interestingly, he was more from Yagle country, which is on the lower Clarence River, but he's gone over the mountains and ended up working as a tracker in northwestern New South Wales in the middle of the 1890s. Eventually, he went back to his traditional country where he passed away in the early 20th century. So there's certainly a wide variety of records that I've used generally to find out more about the lives of trackers. Of course, there's newspaper accounts accessible via Trove. There's also a death certificate for Mungo Park as well. So certainly for some of the trackers, you can start with these salary registers, see the name, and then try and build up a broader picture by looking at all the records that are available. Now, what I did a few years ago, after going through all the salary registers from 1883, that's the first year in which they recorded the particular station where the tracker was employed, up to 1916, what I did then was sort of plot all the stations where the trackers worked, as far as I could tell. There's one or two places that I don't know, I just couldn't work out where they were. I was looking in gazetteers and the old maps, but I just couldn't quite work out where some of the stations were. But I could for about the 200 that are shown here. So each little green dot is a police station. I haven't named all the stations for this particular map because otherwise it just becomes impossible to read. But what it shows is a very interesting distribution. You can see that a lot of trackers were employed in the central west of New South Wales, around Dubbo, and then right up to, and then also in the northwest, that area we were looking at before, up and around Moree. So that tells you something, I think, about the reasons why trackers were employed. You can pick up a lot of stories from those areas, and particularly in the late 1800s, of trackers pursuing, cattle thieves and sheep thieves and horse thieves and investigating crop burnings. So I think one of the reasons why trackers were employed was to, protect that vast agricultural and pastoral wealth that was being developed in the central western and northwestern of New South Wales. So as you go further west, there are fewer trackers employed. There was less intensive pastoral activity out there. And not so many trackers near the coast, which is sort of interesting. Certainly plenty of Aboriginal people living up and down the coast who had the skills to work as trackers, but they tended not to be called, they tended not to be employed in those regions. Again, I guess also because there was perhaps less intensive agriculture, although you do see some of the trackers employed up in and around the north coast, far fewer on the south coast. So yeah, it's interesting to see what you can do with all this information from state records. In this case, I've plotted the location of all the police stations where trackers worked in that period. Now you can see there's a photograph there of tracker Alec Riley from Dubbo. I grew up in Dubbo and remember hearing about Tracker Riley when I was a kid, and that's probably what put me on the path to investigate trackers, I think, to find out more about his life. And through my work in native title, I was very fortunate to meet members of the Riley family. In fact, I'm up in Kempsey next week, and I'm looking forward to meeting a descendant of Tracker Riley, who's a librarian and works up in Kempsey, and give a talk up there as well. So, incredible fellow. He worked for the police for over 40 years, starting in 1911. And you can find out some of the details about his career from what's called the New South Wales Police Staff Service Card. So from about 1916 onwards, they'd done away, I think, with the salary register the police had, and they instead decided to record the names of their employees through this service card system. So when you're out at state records, you can actually you can ask the staff there to do a search for particular the names of trackers who you might know worked post 1916 up to 1973. So I've got some of the best quality photograph I took, but you can see here this is from Tracker Riley, Alexander Riley's police service card, and it records when he started. It records some personal details as well. He was born at Nymagee. Look, you can see there the derogatory language that they were using at the time to describe in that complexion field, but nevertheless, there's still sort of interesting information across the 3 or 4 pages for each staff service card. Also notes the date when he retired in 1950, and also they've updated it later on when Tracker Riley passed away in 1970. The police actually gave him an honour guard at his funeral, and there's a photograph, I think, at the Macquarie Regional Library of that honour guard and the procession that led from Tracker Riley's funeral to the cemetery. So, although it's interesting there, it also notes the date of mentions his retirement back, as I said, in 1950. Now, it turned out when Tracker Riley retired, and he'd worked, as I said, for almost 40 years for the police, and he had solved numerous murders. He had retrieved drowned victims from the river. He'd pursued a wide range of thieves and criminals. He was an expert witness in court. He gave evidence in court numerous times as well. So, incredible fellow. And I think quite rightly, when he retired, he thought, it might be, perhaps I'm in line for a police pension after all the work that he'd done. So, so he approached the police, and they said, "Oh, well, no, sorry, Tracker, you weren't a full-time. You weren't actually a police officer. You weren't a full-time employee. That means you're not entitled to a police pension." So that struck Tracker Riley as being rather odd and rather unfair. And he went to his local state member of parliament, who, to his credit, raised that issue in the Parliament in Macquarie Street in Sydney, but the answer came back again. The Premier said, "Oh, sorry, no, the police don't regard trackers as full-time employees and therefore not eligible for the pension." So, which is very unfair. I don't know, the Riley family to this day still scratch their heads about that. So this is not really fair. So. Anyway, that was the decision that was made at the time. But back to the service cards. Look, certainly if you know the name of a tracker in your family and you want to find about a few more details, then you can go out to the state records and request a copy of the card, and they'll bring that up to you as well. It's well worth having a look at. Now, another series of records, out-of-state records, that have quite illuminating for the work that trackers did are the police diaries of duties and occurrences. So the particular example I've got there is from 1873 out at Brewarrina. So I've just marked in green then all the times that various trackers are mentioned. So the way it works is that there's it's sort of divided into weeks, and what all the police officers and trackers at that particular station were doing each day is recorded. They haven't recorded the name, always the name of the tracker. Sometimes it's just tracker, which again is a bit frustrating, but then you can always then go back to the salary register to find the name of the trackers too. And in this particular instance too, across the month, it also shows that various trackers were coming and going. Like quite often trackers would be asked to transfer horses or other resources from one police station from the other, and that would be written up in the diary of duty and occurrences as well. So where these have survived, you can build up a quite detailed picture over a period of time of what trackers were up to. So it's another sort of fascinating insight. Sometimes it's mentioning that trackers often went out on patrol as well, with a constable or a sergeant, and particularly out west, and they would just go from pastoral station to pastoral station, dropping in, seeing if there was any crimes that they needed to investigate. And other times too, the diary of occurrences, duty and occurrences, will talk about particular cases that trackers were working on too, that they were out pursuing suspected thieves or trying to arrest an escaped prisoner. So that's the diary from Brewarrina in 1873. Now this is the Forbes diary of duty and occurrences from 1865. And now, and Emily will know this, that what happens sometimes is that records that should be out at state records, out at Kingswood, haven't made their way there yet. And Emily, I think the term is archival estrays. I think that's right. But anyway, so this is the Forbes Police Diary of Duty and Occurrences for 1865, but it's not actually at Kingswood. It's held at another place in Forbes. But nevertheless, I was fortunate enough to see it. It's probably a bit hard to read here, but this diary entry relates to Billy Dargan and Ben Hall. So I mentioned Billy Dargan before. We'd seen his name in the salary register for 1863. So, and then for the next 2 years, almost exclusively, he was on the trail of Ben Hall and his gang. And, you know, he traveled thousands of kilometers on horseback, guiding the police in their attempts to apprehend Ben Hall. They had encounters in the mountains near Forbes. At one point, the tables were turned and Ben Hall was chasing Billy Dargan. But, you know, Billy got away, but, you know, he was very tenacious, and he ended up leading the police, along with another tracker called Charlie Edwards, to where Ben Hall was camped in the bush between Parks and Forbes. And then he was armed. A lot of trackers were armed, and he was involved in the shootout that led to the killing of Ben Hall. And there's various accounts of it, and some accounts suggest that it was Billy Dargan exclusively who fired the shots that killed Ben Hall, that he crept up and shot him. But he was certainly there and firing the gun, and he received part of the reward. So some of those details of the pursuit are found in this diary of duty and occurrences from Forbes. Fascinating amount of detail, helps to build up a quite detailed picture of the events leading up to Ben Hall's death. Billy Dargan and Charlie Edwards, very sadly, themselves both died within about 6 months of Ben Hall's death. There's been various accounts that suggested that Billy Dargan was very remorseful for killing Ben Hall, and that affected him mentally, and he took to drinking, and that led to his demise. But it's hard to tell. There's no detailed records. Charlie Edwards was found dead in the bush near Forbes about 3 or 4 months afterwards in very suspicious circumstances. And look, we just don't really know and it's very suspicious that both those trackers were deceased within several months. Ben Hall had a lot of supporters in and around Parkes and Forbes, and they weren't ever able to perhaps to take out their revenge on the police, but whether they focused actions on the trackers, that we just don't know. The 1860s is not that far from the period of frontier violence that Wiradjuri, this is in Wiradjuri country out around Forbes, the Wiradjuri people experienced in the 1830s and the 1840s. So those types of activities were still on people's minds. But look, we don't know, but it does raise my suspicion about why both trackers were dead within several months of Ben Hall's demise. Now, this is a different type of record. I actually copied this one down at one of the regional repositories that State Records has. Most of the records are held out at Kingswood out there where you can access them. But there's, Emily was saying, 6 regional repositories, and I've been to a few of them over the years, and I was down at Wagga a few years ago, and I found this particular record. It's called a forage book for the police. So, of course, in the 1800s, the police relied for transportation on horses. That's how they got about, pretty much, for a long period of time. It's very interesting. One of the roles of trackers quite often was to look after the police horses. Many of them were skilled horse breakers. They'd grown up in the pastoral. They'd often grown up in pastoral camps, so they'd learnt a lot of traditional information from their family, but they'd also picked up sort of agricultural and pastoral skills from growing up on the stations. So trackers were often asked to look after police horses, and in some cases break them in. It's very interesting that there was trackers employed at Redfern right through to about 1950, and Isaac Grosvenor from around the Yass district being a prime example, who worked at Redfern for about 25 years. And it's seeming that he was just employed exclusively to break in police horses. And there's some fantastic photographs of him at the Mitchell Library doing that job. I can't find any record of him actually doing any other tracking work, but he was there looking after the horses. But anyway, so this particular record, it highlights, you can see their tracker Oscar, working out of Moolameen in 1886, and they kept, I guess the police kept close account of the forage that was being provided to their horses. So the fuel of the time. So it's not very much information, I guess, but you can pick up some information about trackers in this series of records, and it does sort of highlight the role of trackers in looking after horses as well. Of course, research, the nature of research has changed over the last 20 years, and obviously Trove being a prime example, being able to search all those fantastic scanned newspaper articles, Ancestry.com as well. State Records has an ongoing relationship with Ancestry.com, where if you have an account, then you can look through quite a few of the scanned state records. And I'm pretty sure you can, at the reading room too, at Kingswood, they've got a computer where you can look up Ancestry.com as well. But back in the day, and this is the New South Wales Police Gazette, it was a publication that the police put out, and it was just for police officers. And it would have, it would have information about arrests. It would have information about people who were wanted for allegedly committing various crimes. And so I used to spend a lot of time, this is going back to even when State Records had their reading room at the Rocks. I'd be going through all the microfilms of the New South Wales Police Gazettes. And they had, the Police Gazettes are great. They had an index at the back, so you could go through there, and they would actually would identify Aboriginal people mentioned in the Gazette, in the index, so then you can go back and see the story. And not surprisingly, there are a lot of mentions of trackers in the Police Gazette as well, all the work that they were doing. For example, here you can see this story. This is from 1893, February 1893, back to Dubbo, and it talks about the charging of a fellow called Arthur Astle the willful murder that took place near Colbaggy. That's a little village between Dubbo and Gilgandra, and that the suspect had been arrested by the sub-inspector, but also the tracker at Dubbo Police. So again, it's very frustrating. Quite often, sometimes they would say, you know, Tracker John or Tracker Alec Riley in the Police Gazette, but quite often they wouldn't. So, but you can then go back again to the salary register to find out some more details. So, and I did that in this case. I looked up the 1893 salary register, and that says the tracker who was employed at Dubbo in that year was known as Tracker Jimmy. And then I did a little bit more research, and I found a death certificate for 1896 for an Aboriginal fellow called Tracker Jimmy Combo, and he's identified on his death certificate as a tracker, and he passed away at Dubbo. So it's likely, I guess, that the tracker referred to in this particular case was Tracker Jimmy Combo, and on his death certificate it said that he came from the Narran River, which is up north, up towards to the west of Walgett. So unfortunately, I don't know any more about Jimmy Combo. Quite a common Aboriginal surname from up in that area, though. So, and there's still Combos around today who that Jimmy probably would be related to. So, again, it's it's part of that whole investigative historical process of taking this record, looking for some other information, looking in trove as well, and you can start to build up, in some cases, quite a detailed picture about the lives of the trackers and some of the work that they do. But so the Police Gazette now, of course, is available on Trove, and you can just set Trove to look exclusively at the Police Gazette, should you so wish. So you can pick up a lot of stories there. Well worth doing so as well. Now, I'll talk briefly about electoral rolls, and you might think that, oh, that's unusual. Why would you look at electoral rolls for information about Aboriginal people? I mean, interestingly, in New South Wales, for New South Wales elections, there was never a specific, there was never any specific law that that said that Aboriginal people could not enroll to vote. They just had to demonstrate that they had a particular residence, and then they were able to vote. So from the 1870s, in some cases, you can actually see the names of Aboriginal people who had enrolled. There's been some great work that was done by Jim Smith looking into the community that was living in the Burragorang Valley at the time, not far from Sydney, on the way to the Southern Highlands, and he found the names of all these Aboriginal people, quite senior Aboriginal people in some cases, who had enrolled to vote. And from that point onwards, in some communities, you can start to pick up the names of Aboriginal people, including trackers who are enlisted on the electoral roll. So this is a electoral roll from 1931 from Orange. So if you follow the pointer, I should have highlighted this, but you can see here, it's got a little circle next to his name, which is quite interesting. It says Archie Murphy, Anson Street Police Tracker. So in some cases, the trackers, particularly when they're employed for a long period of time, would enroll to vote. And I've seen this with other trackers like Wyman McLean down in Wagga. He enrolled to vote at various times as well. And in fact, lots of other Aboriginal people. Now, what's quite interesting is this little circle here. Now, that's quite often an indicator that that person on the electoral roll is an Aboriginal person. It's not, in this instance, there's usually down the bottom another little annotation saying that that circle means that that particular person is not eligible to vote in Commonwealth elections. So from the Federation date onwards in 1901, the rule was that federally, the Aboriginal people couldn't vote, and that didn't change up until much later. So, it's certainly worth having a look on electoral rolls. And again, many of these electoral rolls are now on ancestry.com. I've copied this particular one. State Records has some electoral rolls as well. But it's really worth looking into for your ancestors, just generally, not just the trackers, of course, because quite often you'll see in a lot of the the major Aboriginal settlements, there's quite a few people who are enrolled to vote. You might be talking about Wreck Bay down the south coast, or Wallaga Lake. so many different Burrabidee up near Coonabarabran. You can see quite a few of the residents enrolled to vote. And then you can look, chronologically as well. And I know in some cases I've seen Aboriginal people, they first appear in 1930, and then you can trace them right through, and they're still enrolling to vote into the 1960s and the 1970s. So all sorts of fascinating information there. The fact that also includes people's occupation too, that can be quite interesting too, and where they were living. So you can even plot people's movement over time as well. So electoral rolls really can be quite useful when you're tracing your Aboriginal family and Aboriginal ancestors. Now, I thought I'd finish off today by looking at some of the jail records. You recognise that photograph from the title page of my presentation. I was referring to Billy Bogan, or also known as William Field, his jail record. So look, jail records, and look, it can be very distressing for family members, of course, to look at these records. It's important to keep that in mind. But nevertheless, there can be a lot of, again, interesting information, particularly with the photographs. In some cases, they're going to contain the only known photograph for an Aboriginal person. So that makes them valuable to the family, of course. Aside from the distressing details about their interactions for the police. So this is Billy Bogan or William Field. Of course, like with all records, you have to, you can't believe everything you read, of course. And so you need to check all the information that you see here against other records too. So for example, it says here that Billy was born at Boggabri in 1862. And which certainly the other weight of evidence that I've seen from his death certificate, other newspaper accounts, that's not the case. He was more likely born out on the Bogan River, sort of hence his name too, Billy Bogan, in the early 1860s. Now Billy was a tracker. He was a tracker briefly at Warren on the Macquarie River in 1882. And he was a good tracker. He helped arrest this fellow who'd stolen forage from the police station. But what happened then was that fellow was out on bail. His name was Charles Robinson. Then he tried to poison Billy by giving him a drink and saying, "Come on, Billy, let's be friends." This is before Billy was due to be in court and give evidence against Robinson. So Robinson tried to give him a poisoned drink. But the police investigated the contents of that drink, which contained strychnine, and then Charles Robinson was arrested again and eventually convicted not only of stealing forage from the police station, but attempting to murder Billy. So at that point, Billy had said, look, he'd had enough. He didn't want to really be putting his life on the line for the police, so he left the role as tracker. He'd already had a sort of a difficult life, even as a younger fellow. Aged about 14 or 15, he was working on a pastoral property called Bumbaldry over towards Cowra. And I don't know, the overseer there was a mean fella and threatened, he locked Billy in a room as threatening to thrash him, to beat him. But then that overseer just dropped dead in front of Billy from a heart attack. So you can imagine how sort of traumatic that was. So all these events that Billy experienced, heading into the 1890s was a general economic downturn across the colony, and Billy fell into a period of petty crime. You can see here that he was arrested and convicted at Forbes for break and entering, and eventually he got out of jail there. He served some time in Bathurst jail. This is a photographic description book from Bathurst. He spent some time in Parramatta jail as well. About a year after this, he was arrested and convicted for stealing over at Cowra. Anyway, they popped him on the train after he'd been convicted, manacled to another prisoner, and they were taking him across to Bathurst jail to begin another sentence. But he and that prisoner, as the train slowed down, heading into Carcoar, they overpowered the guard and leapt to their freedom. And they sort of separated. They managed to get the key and unlock the manacles. And the other prisoner, William Katz, he didn't really know where he was. He was captured quite quickly, but Billy knew the country well, and then he headed west out towards what I believe is the traditional country on the Bogan River. He sort of hid out there for a while in the various accounts of sightings. Then he took a right-hand turn, went and travelled north, and he kept away from all the major Aboriginal settlements because he knew the police were probably going to be keeping an eye there. And he ended up making his way up into Charleville. There's some accounts later that he might have worked as a shearer when he was on the run. But when he got up to Charleville, he was certainly well outside his traditional country. And what I found with New South Wales trackers is that, particularly if they're working on their traditional country, is that they would not generally pursue their own countrymen because of that cultural obligation. And I think that's one of the reasons. And there was plenty of trackers who were after Billy in 1895. But eventually, once he got towards Charleville, he was well outside his traditional country, and the trackers up there, and the police ended up arresting him and sending him back to Bathurst, where he was convicted of escaping lawful custody and then sentenced to about 5 or 6 years in Parramatta jail. So very sadly, he got ill in Parramatta and passed away and was buried at Rookwood. So really tragic story from that colonial era. But you can piece together the story that these tragic lives from the records, so partly that are kept by state records. In terms of the photographic description books, I think the earliest photographs, and Emily will be able to correct me, but it's around 1870. So there are, even at that point, there are quite, and the quality of the photographs is really quite stunning. I've been able to look at many originals going back, but they're pretty much, I think, all scanned now and available on the State Records website. So you can actually look at these records on the State Records website. There are, yes, photographs from the early 1870s of in some cases of Aboriginal men and women who were born back before 1820, in some instances, before even the whole process of invasion in their particular country had begun. So, and the descriptions as well, it includes physical descriptions, and sometimes you can see that what they're describing is probably some tribal markings as well. So, incredibly detailed records that can illuminate your family history. Like, as far as I know, like the records I'm sort of talking about, the photograph here, Billy doesn't, as far as I know, have any contemporary descendants. So, but there's many others of photographs. When you're looking on the State Records website, there are contemporary descendants of the people who have been photographed. So this is another jail record this is from 1866. So this is before they started taking photographs. But again, the records can be quite detailed, and this is from Wollongong. It's the Wollongong Jail Entrance and Description Book. So it's pretty much got the same type of information that you would find in a photographic description book, but just without a photograph. So this is for an Aboriginal fellow called John Wentworth, who's quite sort of well known from the country, from the Shoalhaven right up to La Perouse as well. I don't know if he ever worked as a tracker, but I reckon he could have, definitely. He would have had the skills, I'm sure. Like, it's interesting that his occupation, it's probably a bit hard to read on the screen, but it actually says horsebreaker. So, so he obviously worked with horses. So he could have well done that work for the police, but as far as I know, he never did. So it has other information about where he was born on the Shoalhaven, his physical description, and it also identifies him as an Aboriginal person as well. So very interesting detail here. But of course, again, the jail records, there's a lot of information that's recorded, and quite often Aboriginal people are just being arrested for very petty crimes and being locked up for no apparent reason at all. So you just have to keep in mind when you're looking through these records that it can be quite distressing, particularly if it's your family member, of course, to see all that information recorded. Well, look, that's pretty much all the records I wanted to go through today. So, look, if you're wanting to read a bit more about trackers, there's a photo of the cover of my book, Pathfinders, so you can pick that up from bookstores.